Hello, good morning, and welcome to Unacademy IAS, a one-stop destination for all the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to another session of the Hindu News Analysis dated 17th December 2024. In today's discussion, I have taken different articles from different newspapers, including the Hindu newspaper. I have taken totally 10 articles. The last two are basically certain factual points regarding certain personalities. The whole idea is to make the discussion much more comprehensive and address all of your current affairs requirements to clear the civil services examination. If you like these initiatives, do hit the like button. And if you yet to subscribe to our YouTube channel, kindly do it right now. So this is a list of the newspaper articles that I'll be discussing today. Before I start the discussion, yesterday I got a very interesting mail from a student. The student asked me, "Sir, in the detailed application form DAF, I've written reading books, specifically economics books, as my hobby. Now tell me which books should I read so that I appear for the interview." For a minute, I was just puzzled because if you do not have the habit or the hobby of reading books, specifically economics books, why do you write that particular hobby in the DAF? And that is where generally the students will get stuck up in the interview. But those who are appearing for next year, and if you say, underline this particular point, if you say, "Sir, reading economics books is interesting to me, it is my hobby, can you please give me certain recommendations?" In today's lecture, I'll give you two recommendations. One is this particular book. The book is titled India as a Tryst with Destiny. The authors are Mr. Arvind Panageria and Mr. Jagdish Bhagwati, very well-known economic experts. The second one, a very favorite, very near and dear to my heart. This is the second book that is titled Accidental India. The author of the book is Mr. Shankar Iyer, a very well-known author. These are the two books. If you are interested, again underline the term, if you are interested to read books and you have time in addition to preparing for the civil services examination, I would recommend these two books. I'm reminded of a statement that was written by Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi in the foreword in one more favorite book of mine, Everybody Loves a Good Drought. The author of that particular book is Mr. P. Sainath. In the foreword, Mr. Gandhi writes, "There are books and then there are these books. These books never stop selling. These books are read, are reread. They are converted into documentaries, etc. They become part of our consciousness. And these two books are very much part of my consciousness. If you are interested, and again, I'm not saying everybody will like these books. It all depends on your interest. If you're interested, do give it a try." Now, before I start, a very important announcement. If you're preparing for the upcoming civil services examination for 26 or 27, we have a very good offer for you. If you subscribe to the program for 9 months, we will provide an extension of another 9 months free of cost. You will pay for 9 months. We will give you total 18 months of subscription. Same thing in case of 12 months as well as 18 months. And once you subscribe to all of these particular or any one of these particular programs, you will get access to all the online classes, be it in bilingual, Hindi or English. You will be able to write multiple quality prelims as well as a mains test series. And you will also be able to get access to our mentorship assistance. If you're interested, please do check out the details in the description given below. Let me start the discussion. And before I start, one more very important point here. Today, a lot of these articles which are there in Hindu newspaper are political in nature. and UPSC doesn't ask you questions on polity. There is one article on El Nino, La Nina, purely factual information that you must have studied in geography. I have not touched that. There is second article in the text and context page regarding how the judges are removed. That was discussed by Chetan sir yesterday and in the previous sessions as well. If you're yet to see that, please have a look at it. And that's a precise reason I'm not going to touch those articles today. Let's start. The first article in the central page, editorial page of Hindu newspaper, the hidden cost of greenwashing Indian Railways. What are the important points? Point number one, back in the year 2018, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs announced that they want to ensure the Indian Railways will have 100% electrification. Understand this. They announced that Indian Railways will have 100% electrification. Essentially means what? The engines which are using diesel will be replaced with the engines which will use electricity to operate, to run the trains. And again in the year 2022, following this, in the year 2022, the Government of India came out with National Rail Plan. They came out with the National Rail Plan. Under the National Rail Plan, there are multiple provisions. Some of these important provisions were by 2030. Remember this. Basically, the National Rail Plan has a target year of 2030. By 2030, the Government of India wanted to increase the total freight transportation done by railways from around 27% to 45%. They will also use the term modal share of freight transportation. Modal share of freight. That is essentially, like I discussed yesterday, there are different modes of transportation which are used to transport goods in India. Basically used in representing the freight. One is a road, the inland waterways, then there is a railways. When the plan was proposed, the railways accounted for somewhere around 27% of the total freight transportation done in India. Under this particular plan, the argument was we will increase it to 45%. Another very important provision of the railway plan was we will have 100% electrification. 100% electrification of the railway network. Third, we will basically go ahead and develop the infrastructure. We will basically develop the infrastructure sufficient to meet the demand which will keep on rising till 2050. So whatever is the rise in the demand till 2050, sufficient amount of infrastructure we will develop it today. And the fourth very important provision was to basically identify and develop freight corridors and to promote private sector participation. To promote private sector participation. So these are some of the very important points under the National Rail Plan which was announced by the government. After this, in 2024, there was one more very important piece of news which was reported in the month of January. In the month of January, the Government of India signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with USAID. They signed an MOU with USAID, under which the concept was we will share lot of knowledge, we will exchange information, USAID will provide lot of assistance, hand-holding services for the Indian Railways. Using all of this, we want to achieve net zero emission. We want to achieve net zero emission by 2030. So these are certain very important points associated with the Indian Railways. Please be very careful. Harshit Rana says 2070. My dear, it's not 2070. 2070 is for overall net zero emission for India. It is for overall India. For Indian Railways, the target is 2030. Now, how do you connect all of this let's say, pieces of information with what is given in the article here. Essentially, the article discusses why has the government of India targeted the Indian railways, and why government of India wants to go for electrification of railways. And is it required? What are the repercussions? Is it required? Let's try and understand this. Point number one, the government of India, like already mentioned, has targeted 2030 for essentially converting all the, the electrification of all the railway network in India. And when you want to electrify the railway network, essentially you have to replace the engines. The diesel run or diesel operated engines now will have to be shifted. You will have to get new engines. You will have to invest a lot of money in all of this. But what is the problem here? What is the concern? Point number one, you have already spent a lot of money. You have incurred a lot of expenditure. You have incurred a lot of expenditure in developing and procuring these particular railway engines. Now you want to change the fitting, you want to, let's say, change the machines like this. It will increase the overall expenditure that the government will have to incur. And why is this relevant? Why is this a problem here? It is a problem because, understand this carefully, the government basically says they are shifting to 100% electrification to achieve multiple objectives. The two very important objectives are, one, the government wants to reduce the import dependence on fuels. The government wants to reduce what? The import dependence of fuels. We import a lot of fuels into India and we use these fuels for transportation purposes. And as a result of this, we end up spending a lot of our dollars in the international market. And if you look at the data, more than 80% of the fuel that is required in India, we import it in the form of, let's say, crude oil. So we want to reduce the import dependence. How? Rather than using, let's say, diesel, if I shift to using electricity, I don't have to consume diesel. If a reduction of diesel consumption happens, import dependence will come down. That is point number one. And point number two, this is also very important or equally important. If you reduce the consumption of diesel, automatically the pollution that you will cause will become lesser. So Government of India argued that we will promote environment-friendly approach. Are the two objectives clear to all of you? We will promote the environment-friendly approach. We will protect the environment by having this kind of a shift. Now, what this author basically argues is, these are not going to be achieved by going for 100% electrification. How so? Point number one, if you shift the engines, if you change the engines, it will increase the expenditure. And what is the problem with increasing expenditure here? Essentially, there is one ratio in case of railways. Please remember this. It is called as operating ratio. It is essentially the operating ratio, OR. In case of railways, the operating ratio, or generally what does it mean? To generate a revenue of, let's say, 100 rupees, how much expenditure you will incur? I'll repeat it again. To generate a revenue of 100 rupees, how much expenditure you will incur? That is OR. Now, in case of railways, couple of years ago or a decade ago, the OR was somewhere around 90, which means you spend 90 and generate 100. But because of various expenditures incurred by the government, OR has kept on increasing. It hit up to 98 in recent years. Now, if you spend money to replace engines, will it not increase the numerator, that is the overall expenditure that you are going to incur? That is a concern. Point number one. Point number two, you talk about reducing import dependence on crude oil. Let's evaluate that particular argument. Out of the total crude oil that is imported, let's talk about diesel here. Which of the segment consumes the highest amount of diesel? The transportation segment accounts for the highest consumption. Right? I hope you understand this. Transportation. If you're wondering, sir, apart from transportation, do we use diesel anywhere else? Of course, yes. For example, agriculture sector. Very often when you talk about, let's say, agriculture sector, there are pumps which use diesel. There is a fishery sector where the vessels, or let's say the fishing vessels, use diesel. So diesel is used in multiple areas. Majority of it is consumed in transportation. And whenever you talk about transportation, there itself, it is the road mode of a transportation which accounts for highest consumption of diesel. Is the point clear? It is the road which consumes the highest road transportation. And when I say road transportation, here essentially the trucks which are using roads for transportation consume very high amount of diesel. And when you evaluate all of this, when you dissect all of this information, essentially you will realize that the railways account for just around 2%. Railways accounts for just around 2% of the diesel consumed. Which means if you electrify the railways, you will reduce the diesel consumption just by 2%. You will essentially reduce the diesel consumption equivalent to the diesel that is consumed by railways, which is just 2%. So argument is one. To what extent can you reduce your import dependence? That is negligible. Is the point clear? It is negligible. And another very important argument of the government was, it is environment friendly. Let's evaluate that as well. When you say environment friendly, your argument is you will not burn diesel, emissions will not happen because you will consume electricity to operate the trains. But from where do you purchase this electricity? From where do you get this electricity? You will get majority of the electricity that is produced in India essentially comes from thermal power plants. Correct? It comes from thermal power plants. Thermal mainly here means burning of coal to produce electricity. So here is a situation where you want to reduce the burning of diesel, you want to become environment friendly, so you have shifted to using electricity. But this electricity that you are purchasing and using it to operate the train comes from a thermal power plant. And the thermal power plant essentially is burning coal. And when you burn coal, don't you think the emissions that will be caused would be very, very high? So in what way are you saying that? In what way are you basically arguing that by 100% electrification, you will become environment friendly? That is one concern. Second concern is, you talk about, let's say, the usage of railways. Majority of the revenue that the railways generate, that is more than 50% of the revenue that the railway generates through freight transportation is basically by transporting coal. Have a look at the point here. More than 50% of the total revenue generated by the railways in India is by transporting coal itself. Right? Apart from coal, it will also be involved in transportation of many other goods, right? Or let's say commodities in India. So these are some of the arguments which have been put forward by the author here to basically say that although the government is announcing all of this, that is, let's say, National Rail Plan, 100% electrification, net zero emission, etc., there are a lot of arguments in opposition to whatever the government of India has announced so far in the context of Indian Railways. Done? Right? So these are certain very important points regarding the article provided here. In association of these points that I've discussed, I've given an MCQ. Consider the following statements regarding National Rail Plan 2030. It has aimed to increase the freight share to 45%, 100% electrification of railways, reduce the transit time of the trains. How many of these statements are true? Do let me know in the chat section. If you do not know, don't worry, I'll discuss the key at the end of the discussion. Now, second article that I want to discuss is higher GST on tobacco and sugar-rated beverages. That is again in the central page. Let's dissect all the points which are given in the article. Point number 1, the Government of India has implemented an indirect tax reform by the name of GST, Goods and Services Tax. It's been more than 7 years now. But the argument is, under GST as of now, the highest rate that has been imposed by the government, and when I say government in the context of GST, please remember, you will have to remember that it is the GST Council. Is the point clear to all of you? It is the GST Council which will take all the decisions regarding the GST. GST Council comprises of representation of the central government as well as state governments. So when I say government in the context of GST, do not assume it to be the central government only. Along with the center, there is participation of the states as well. Now, what are the important points? Under GST, the highest rate which has been imposed by the government as of now is 28%. But please make a note of this. According to the GST law means the act, 28% is not the highest rate that is allowed under the law. The law allows for a peak rate. Remember this. It allows for a peak rate of 40%. It allows for a peak rate of 40%. Peak rate means what? The highest rate that you can impose under GST is 40%. And whenever you talk about GST, two equal components, CGST and SGST. This is point number 1. Point number 2, when you talk about, let's say, the highest rate which is imposed right now, 28%, there are certain commodities which are attracting 28%. One is the tobacco products. Such as BDs, cigarettes, right? And the other one is the sugar products. Now, Government of India, right, basically, and rather than say, let's say Government of India, the GST Council has set up a group of ministers, and this group of ministers, essentially a committee or a panel, has recommended that rather than imposing 28% on tobacco products and sugar products, or right, let's say the sugared beverages, we should increase the GST rate to 35%. From 28%, we should increase the tax rate to how much? 35%. What is the argument? Argument is very simple. India is one of the largest countries in terms of people consuming tobacco products. And it is also suffering from the ill effects of non-communicable diseases. One of these is diabetes. And diabetes, one of the causes behind that is consumption of harmful products, or let's say unhealthy products such as sugar or aerated beverages. So the argument of the government is very simple now. Why don't we target, or the committee is simple now, why don't we target these kind of products and impose a very high rate of taxation? And what would happen when you impose a very high rate of taxation, that is, let's say from 28% to 35%, one, the market price of the product will increase. The market price of the products will start increasing. And when the market prices of the products will start increasing, automatically the consumption or the demand for such commodities in the market is expected to take a hit. And in the same process, the government will be able to collect a higher amount of taxes. Higher tax collection can be done by government. This is essentially the argument. You can increase the tax rate, as a result of which the market prices will increase and the government will be able to collect higher amount of taxes, and the demand for such products will also be affected. So thereby you are achieving two objectives. You are prohibiting, you are pushing away certain people from higher consumption of this, and at the same point of time, those who consume will pay more taxes, you will collect more taxes. But at the same point of time, the author also says there is a concern here. What is the concern? The author uses a term called as taxes overshifting. Understand the term here. Taxes overshifting. And what do you mean by taxes overshift here? The taxes overshift essentially means, imagine the government will increase the tax rate from 8% to 10%. The market prices will not increase by the same margin, rather by higher margin. Let me give you one example. Let's say right now the selling price is 100 and the government has a 12% GST rate, hypothetical number. Government has 12% GST rate. The market price should be how much? It should be 112 rupees. If government will increase the tax rate from 12% to let's say 15%, if the government will increase it to 15, I know there is no GST slab of 15%. I know that. You don't worry. That's the reason I said hypothetically. If the government will increase the tax rate from 12 to let's say 15%, the sellers are supposed to increase the market price from 100 rupees to 115. What if rather than increasing it to 115 rupees, sellers rather will increase it to let's say 118 rupees? This is nothing but overshifting of burden or overshifting of taxation. And you might be thinking, sir, why will the seller do this? Is it not hampering the sales, etc.? My dear, when you talk about tobacco products, don't you think these are the products which are habit-forming products? Alcoholic products, habit-forming products. The prices might increase. People will continue to consume in higher quantity. They will continue to consume these particular products. So the argument is there might be overshifting of the taxation. The government has to be very careful about this, because the sellers might simply point the fingers at the government and say, the taxes have been increased from 28 to 35, hence I've increased the selling price. And a common man, Aam Aadmi such as you and me, may not understand the breakup of the MRP, because the MRP is printed on the packets. So the third point which you need to understand from this particular article is the concern of overshifting. Fourth very important point, right now, whenever you talk about let's say tobacco products such as cigarettes and BDs, there is a very important point mentioned. The author simply says, when you purchase a BD or cigarette, out of the market price, very small percentage is the tax in the form of BDs compared to cigarettes. Is the point clear? If you pay a certain amount of money for a cigarette and a BD, in case of a cigarette, out of the total price, a very high amount is in the form of a taxation compared to BDs. Why is this a problem? Author says this is a problem. Why is this a problem? Make a note of this. India is a signatory to a World Health Organization Framework Convention. Right? The name of this particular convention is World Health Organization, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. WHO FCTC, World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. This was discussed and let's say brought into implementation from the year 2005. India is a signatory. India ratified it. India has implemented this from the year 2005. So the argument under this WHO FCTC is that the tax rate should not be very different, or there should not be huge difference in the tax rates imposed on different tobacco products. Why? If the tax rates are different or very much dissimilar, very much different like this, and these products are sold in the market, same market to the consumer, if the government will increase the taxes or the market prices will increase, people will not stop buying them, rather substitute them. I hope you understand this particular point. I'll repeat this again. People will not stop buying them. People will simply substitute them. That is, imagine there are two tobacco products. On one of them, the market price increases. So for whatever reason, people will simply switch over from this tobacco product to another tobacco product. This is the substitution. Rather than this, if the tax rates are similar, very close by, And if the government increases the tax rate on all the products, the tax rate will be higher now, the market prices will be much larger. This will basically push away lot of consumers. Right, so that is one more very important point. Please make a note of this. That is a WHO FCTC. Okay. Now, point number 5. In case of tobacco products, the government imposes, I said, GST. And what is the GST rate applicable? 28%. The proposal is to increase it to 35%. Rather, the author simply says, why not increase it all the way from 28% to 40% that is allowed under GST? Why not increase it rather than to 35 to 40%? If you increase it to 40%, what generally will happen is the market prices will become much higher. And when the market prices will become much higher, don't you think you will push away, you will basically prohibit more number of people from consuming these tobacco products. And those who will consume will end up paying higher amount of taxes. Your revenue collection will also be higher. So why not think of directly increasing it to 40? Why just to 35%? That is point number 5. Point number 6, important point. The author simply says, or the writer says, GST is a type of, please make a note of this, ad valorem tax. GST is a type of ad valorem tax. Now, what is this concept of an ad valorem tax? Ad valorem taxes are type of taxes which are imposed and collected dependent on the value of the product. The prices that are imposed and collected are on the value of the product. For example, you go to the market, let's say price of the product is 100 rupee. On the value, GST is imposed and collected. So GST is an ad valorem product. Right? So argument is, rather than imposing only ad valorem taxes or having a higher ad valorem taxes, there are, right, let's say specific taxes as well. Right? What do you mean by specific taxes? The specific taxes essentially are imposed and collected based on physical attributes of the product, based on certain quantity, etc. For example, if you purchase 1 liter of fuel, the central government will have a tax per liter of fuel. Even in case of tobacco products, when these are sold in groups of, let's say, 100, 500 like this, there is a specific tax that is imposed by the government based on the number of products. And that is essentially the specific tax. So increase the specific tax as well, in addition to ad valorem tax, so that, right, prohibition will be much more stringent, or let's say more effective prohibition can be done against consumption of tobacco products. And finally, the 7th point which is mentioned in the article is regarding, right, let's say the sugared beverages. The sugared beverages, like I earlier mentioned, there is a higher economic impact that can be calculated in terms of, let's say, the side effects of the sugared beverages consumption as well as tobacco consumption. In fact, the writer himself in one of the columns says the economic impact of, in terms of, let's say, loss of lives is much higher in case of India when tobacco is consumed compared to how much taxes we are actually collecting from these tobacco products. So in the same way, even, let's say, more consumption of sugared products is not considered good. There are side effects to all of this. There is an economic cost to pay when people will consume all of these sugared products. Right? So argument is, why don't you impose a higher amount of tax even on these sugared beverages or sugared products, so that the market prices will increase and the consumption is controlled. So these are certain important points which are mentioned in the article regarding higher GST rate on tobacco as well as sugared products sold in the market. Suman Kumar says, example of sugar beverage product, my dear, Coca-Cola. Again, I'm not targeting Coca-Cola, by the way, right? Or for that matter, let's say Pepsi. Right? These are all basically the sugared beverage products. Okay, so MCQ 49, consider the following statements. The peak rate allowed under GST law is 28%. GST is an example of ad valorem tax. Indirect taxes are progressive in nature. How many of the statements are true? Do let me know in the chat section. If you do not know, don't worry. I'll discuss the key answer at the end of the discussion. Let me go forward. A descriptive answer writing practice. The GST can be weaponized to discourage the consumption of harmful goods, at the same time generate revenues for the government. Elaborate. Discuss the points that we have discussed. Mention those. Write the critical viewpoint, etc. Next article, green hydrogen. Green hydrogen and the financing challenge. The government of India in the last 4 to 5 years has implemented a lot of measures to promote green hydrogen. Essentially, green hydrogen refers to production of hydrogen which is done using renewable energy. For example, you will use solar energy, you will use wind energy, that is electricity produced. There is a process or there is a mechanism where a tool called as electrolyzer, a tool or an equipment called as electrolyzer is used to essentially split the water molecules. The water molecules will be split into the hydrogen as well as oxygen, right? So essentially this is the process which is going to create hydrogen, which is called as a green hydrogen. Now government of India back in the year 2021, understand the evolution now, back in the year 2021 announced National Hydrogen Mission, National Green Hydrogen Mission. Under this particular National Green Hydrogen Mission, the government wanted to ensure that India will become a market where investments will happen. There will be a lot of production of green hydrogen. This green hydrogen can be sufficient to supply to the domestic market as well as to the international market. That was essentially the concept that was introduced back in the year 2021. Then in 2022, government basically announced a green hydrogen policy. The government announced a green hydrogen policy. Under the green hydrogen policy, government basically said, you require renewable energy. Correct? You require renewable energy because please understand, the hydrogen can be produced even through other sources. For example, there is a process called as coal gasification. But coal gasification is not as clean as, let's say, green hydrogen. Right? So argument is you will require renewable energy, right? Such as solar energy, wind energy, etc. We will give you the first preference whenever you want to purchase this kind of a renewable energy. And not just this, government also announced the concept of open access. They announced the concept of open access, under which the grid network that has been developed can be easily utilized by these companies to get the transported or to get the renewable energy transported from one region to another region. In addition to this, government also under the PLI, production linked incentive, under PLI has basically announced a lot of incentives for promotion of green hydrogen in India. Right? For example, I said you need an equipment by the name of electrolyzer. You need an equipment by the name of electrolyzer. Government has incentives under PLI to promote domestic production of electrolyzer. Because remember this, in the process of producing green hydrogen, one of the very important cost which will add to the overall expenditure is the cost of electrolyzer itself. So under PLI also there are initiatives, or let's say there are incentives to promote production of electrolyzer which will help in production of green hydrogen. So these are some of the initiatives that have been undertaken by the government in the last 4 to 5 years to promote green hydrogen production. But what has happened is, although government of India targets production of green hydrogen, as a result of which you can reduce import dependence. For example, fuel import dependence can be reduced. It can generate lakhs of job opportunities in India. It can lead to a lot of investments in India. The investment target for green hydrogen is $100 billion, very huge amount of investment target. Although a lot of these measures are targeted, or let's say a lot of these objectives have been set up by Government of India, the production of green hydrogen faces a certain problems in India. What are the problems are the points discussed in the article. Let's go one by one. Like I said, the green hydrogen production can be done, and there are other ways to produce the hydrogen. There is a process called as a blue hydrogen, right? Let's say gray hydrogen, etc. Now, when you compare the cost of production, the green hydrogen, I'll simply write GH here, right? Or capital GH, green hydrogen, the per kg cost of this is in the range of around $5 to $6. I'm rounding off the numbers, around $5 to $6. When you compare this with other modes or other types of hydrogen, let's say blue or gray hydrogen, the cost is in the range of $1.9 to $2.4. So now you tell me, if you are a buyer of hydrogen in the market, and by the way, sir, who are the buyers of hydrogen? Right, let's say refining companies, fertilizer production companies, there are a lot of buyers. So if you're a buyer of hydrogen in the market, would you prefer to buy in the form of green hydrogen, or would you prefer to buy the blue or gray hydrogen? Obviously, the costing is a very important factor for you. You will prefer to purchase the second type of a hydrogen rather than the first type. That is the first concern. Second concern is the government wants to export this to international market, right? Ultimately, government wants, we will sell this hydrogen in the domestic market and also export it to international market. The problem is, in case of USA, the government of USA under the presidency of Mr. Joe Biden has implemented a policy, a measure by the name of Inflation Reduction Act. Under Inflation Reduction Act, out of all the measures that have been undertaken, there is one measure to basically promote production of hydrogen in the domestic market. And the government there is providing lot of subsidies to promote production of this. So obviously the production of the hydrogen in USA becomes much more cheaper compared to the production of hydrogen in India. That is the second concern. Point number 3. Why is the cost higher? Why in case of green hydrogen the cost is higher? The authors basically argue that it is higher because the cost of capital is higher and the cost of electrolyzer is also higher. Is the point clear to all of you? The cost of capital is higher and the cost of electrolyzer is also higher. What do you mean by cost of capital? Imagine I will invest a certain amount of money and this manufacturing facility will produce green hydrogen. But to invest this particular amount of money in this factory, I took a loan. And please remember this, these investments are, one, not very small, these are very large investments. And point number 2, these investments generally are done for a very longer duration. Infrastructure of any sort requires long-term investments. And because there is so much of uncertainty regarding this, because of higher risk involved in these kind of projects, if I take a loan from a bank and the bank will charge a higher rate of interest. And when the bank will charge a higher rate of interest, the cost of capital for me would be higher. And because a lot of investment is done, essentially which is borrowed from the market, the cost of capital higher means the overall project cost would be higher. And when the overall project cost is higher, the production cost or the operating cost will also become higher. This makes the green hydrogen, the production cost of green hydrogen much higher, and this becomes a problem. Is it okay? Now, what should be done? We are not able to promote production to a higher level. We are not able to, right, as of now, right, proposals are there. A lot of proposals have been done to invest in multiple states in India by multiple companies regarding green hydrogen production. So what should be done? What is the way forward? These are some of the recommendations which have been provided in the article. Understand this carefully. Point number 1, the government will have to provide more incentives. Rather than providing incentives for production, can government provide incentives in other form? Sir, what do you mean by incentives in another form? Let me explain to you. One of the reasons I said why the cost of producing green hydrogen is higher is because of cost of capital. And why the interest rates charged are higher? Because the risk is higher. Lot of uncertainties involved in the segment. Can Government of India start providing guarantees for the projects? Can the government start providing guarantees on the loans which are taken by the developers? Sir, any example where I can easily understand what is the concept of guarantees? There is a trust which has been set up by Government of India by the name of Credit Guarantee Trust for Micro and Small Enterprises, CGTMSE. Remember this, because in MSME sector, questions have been asked by UPSC. I am trying to give you one more point. There is a trust, Credit Guarantee Trust for Micro and Small Enterprises. Under this, whenever loans are given by the bank to a micro enterprise, certain portion of the loan is guaranteed by the trust. That is, if the borrower doesn't repay, the bank can get the money from the trust like this. Certain portion is guaranteed. Now, what is the outcome of this? When certain portion of the loan is guaranteed, now the bank will feel more secure to provide loans. And even if they are not able to recollect, there is a trust from where they can get. This will basically promote more and more loans at lesser rate of interest for the MSEs. So, can we try to use this model in case of, let's say, the green hydrogen projects? One. Second one, the government will have to use its diplomatic powers. Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India should use their diplomatic powers and try to enter into agreements with other countries where we can easily produce in India and export it to other countries. Any example? There is an agreement which has been signed between Australia and Japan. There is an agreement between Australia and Japan wherein the coal gasification process will be used to produce hydrogen in Australia, will be converted into liquid form and then transported from Australia to Japan, which will use this hydrogen. This is the kind of agreement that is existing between two countries. Now, these kind of agreements should also be signed by Indian government with other countries. So, agreements, right? For example, bilateral agreements can be signed by the government to promote export from India to other countries. And this will provide, I hope you understand, whenever agreements are existing like this, it simply means there is a ready-made market, there is a ready-made buyer for the product. Point number 3, right? Point number 3. Can we provide funding in one more form? There is a term called as, understand this, there is a term called as, right, anchor plus financing model. There is something called as anchor plus financing model. What do you mean by anchor plus financing model? It essentially means there is one anchor. Anchor means a support. There is one anchor who will basically ensure that the loans are provided to other components or other buyers in the segment, and the guarantees are provided by this anchor. This is called as anchor plus financing model. In MSME sector, anchor plus financing model is very much implemented. For example, Mudra, right? I hope you have heard of Mudra Yojana. Under Mudra Yojana, it is similar to the concept of anchor plus financing model itself. So, these are some of the recommendations that have been provided by the authors in order to promote green hydrogen investments as well as production, consumption and export from Indian market to rest of the world. Done? So, these are certain points. Now, for practice purpose, I have given one more question here. The gap between announcement and the actual investment of green hydrogen projects shows that the sector faces barriers beyond the technological readiness. Elaborate. This particular statement, I've taken it from the article itself. Okay. Now, next article. The president of Sri Lanka, the first visit to another country by president of Sri Lanka has been done to India now. And this is very significant. It's very important. Why? Historically speaking, there are very close relations or the ties which will transcend, which will go beyond just economics, which are existing between India and Sri Lanka. There are cultural relations, there are economic relations, and so on and so forth. And very often, one or the other news is there in the newspaper regarding the relationship between India and Sri Lanka. It could be in the context of Tamil issue, it could be in the context of fishermen, etc. So, the elections in Sri Lanka, presidential elections mind you, were conducted in the month of September. Right? The new president of Sri Lanka, Anurag Kumara Dissanayake, the first state visit has been done by this president of Sri Lanka to India. And what is the importance of this? Whenever the president, the highest functioning, let's say, person in a country visits a country and makes it as the first visit, that always carries certain significance. It basically shows that this country gives a very high priority to the relation with this country. That is, Sri Lanka is basically saying India is very, very important to us. And what are the various important points here? Please listen to me carefully. Sri Lanka very recently has faced a lot of economic crisis. There was a point of time in 2022 when Sri Lanka had an import cover of just 1 month. In nutshell, it had forex reserves which were sufficient to take care of 1 month imports. The GDP of Sri Lanka took a hit. First, pandemic affected it, and after that there was a larger economic crisis. The GDP shrank to such an extent that at one point of time, the GDP of Sri Lanka, which was in the range of $90 billion, somewhere in the range of $94.5 billion, shrank, fell down to around $74 billion. The forex reserves were depleted. The debt of the government was 112% of GDP. Mind you, 112% of GDP. At this particular point of time, India, along with many other countries, there is a group called as Paris Club. Right? More than 20 countries essentially provide assistance. So, India provided a lot of assistance to Sri Lanka. And that is what is being mentioned by the president of Sri Lanka here. He says, India helped us a lot. And please understand, in all the points which are provided here, I have taken one article from Hindustan Times and one article from Hindu newspaper. Out of all the articles provided or all the points which are provided in multiple articles, I felt 3 points are very important for you to talk about international relations as well as the economic relations. First one is, Government of India very often has raised concern regarding the Chinese ships which are docking in the ports of Sri Lanka. And as such, the Chinese approach of string of pearls, that is basically an investment in multiple ports surrounding India, has been a cause of concern, has been one of the security concerns for Government of India. Same way, China had made a lot of investments in Sri Lanka, and Government of India very often has raised concerns regarding this. So, regarding the Chinese ships docking at the port of Sri Lanka, earlier concerns were raised, and now the president of Sri Lanka says he will not allow the land of Sri Lanka to be used for activities against the interest of India. This is a very important statement. I'll repeat the statement. The president says he shall not allow the land of Sri Lanka to be used for activities against India. That's basically a reconfirmation, basically promoting or let's say providing certain comfort or relief to Government of India. That is point number one. Point number two, the Government of India has a program by the name of Development Cooperation Program. What is this development cooperation program? And this is not a new one, by the way. Understand this. Just after independence only, just after independence in India, India provided visas for 70 students from different Asian countries to come into India and study, essentially signifying the fact that India will promote the policy where it will provide assistance to many other Asian countries, which are basically, right, let's say the neighborhood countries of India. In fact, Government of India has a policy of Act East Asia. And so argument here is government under this particular program has been providing multiple forms of assistance to many neighboring countries. For example, this was there in the newspaper in the context of Maldives as well. Remember this. The concept of cooperation program of Government of India, where Government of India annually will provide lot of grants to many other countries. It was there in the context of Maldives as well. So we provide assistance in the form of loans. We provide assistance in the form of grants. We provide assistance in the form of aid also. Let's say there is a natural disaster. In the form of humanitarian aid, also we provide assistance. We provide technological assistance, etc. So for multiple Asian countries, in the form of all of this assistance has been provided by the government under the broader heading called as Development Cooperation Program. And the same thing is applicable even in the context of Sri Lanka. In lot of the infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, Government of India has provided assistance, has invested money, right, etc. So this is the second point. And the third point, issue that was raised by Sri Lanka is, right, let's say deep trenching fishing, deep trenching fishing, essentially, or deep trawler fishing. They use the term deep trawling fishing. Right, what is this deep trawling fishing? If you see the picture here, you will see there is a boat which has cast its net at the lowest level at the surface of the sea. So whenever you see these fishing boats use their fishing nets, and they will basically throw it at the surface of the sea, and they'll keep on fishing like this. This is called as a deep trawling fishing. This is one concern which the Sri Lankan government has kept on raising against Indian fishermen. In addition to this, they also argue that a lot of times Indian fishermen cross international waters, enter into territorial waters of Sri Lanka, and this will lead to friction between fishermen of two countries. It's a security issue, and much more importantly, when you conduct a deep trawling fishing as shown in the picture here, there is a loss of biodiversity, loss of ecosystem. So this is one more point which has been raised from the side of Sri Lanka regarding the India-Sri Lanka bilateral relations. So these are, right, okay, somebody says, sir, it is bottom trawling. Yes, right, bottom trawling, right, it is also referred as bottom trawling. Okay, so these are certain important points. Make a note of this. Next, couple of smaller articles now. Supreme Court of India has sought a response on a PIL, the public interest litigation regarding chemical castration. Very often in the newspaper and in the news, you will come across articles or discussion regarding rape cases in India. Despite many of the reforms undertaken by the government, right, the cases continue to happen in India. Now, against this, there is a PIL which has been filed in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of India has referred these, right, requests that have been made to, right, essentially to the government. It has sought the government response. What are the important points here? The petition basically demands or basically has a request at Supreme Court of India to issue directives regarding some of the following. Point number one, whenever a person is convicted of raping either a children, right, or let's say women, should have to undergo chemical castration. Essentially, this is a process to reduce the sex drive, right, by reducing the testosterone in the humans. So one demand, or let's say one point that has been provided in the petition or requested to the Supreme Court is, one, there should be a chemical castration. And the petition has sought Supreme Court of India to issue a directive to Law Commission to look into legally how this can be introduced. This is the first. Second one, whenever there are cases of rape, whenever there are persons being accused of rape, in no condition bails shall be granted to them. The bail should not be granted to them. And in many of the cases you must have seen, the bail is granted. The person who is accused of committing rape will basically take, let's say, action against, or let's say kill the person who has been raped. So in no cases, no instances, the bail shall be granted to the person. That is the second request. The third request is there should be a speedy trial that should be conducted, because in many cases the trial that is conducted is very slow. It will lead to harassment of the person who has already undergone a traumatic event such as a rape. So these are some of the requests that have been raised or that have been put forward in the public interest litigation by the group of lawyers in the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court. And this has been referred by the Supreme Court to the Government of India, and they have sought a reply from the government. Much more importantly, the justice who is presiding over this particular case has made an observation. The justice simply said, chemical castration will be very, very radical. The problem with rape cases in India is not effective policy or effective enforcement of the laws. The lacuna is that we are not able to implement the laws to the fullest extent. Right? That is the reason why these cases generally keep on re-happening in India. That is the observation that has been done by Justice Kant, who is presiding over the case here. Done? So these are certain important points regarding the article. Next, OTT regulation in India. Please understand, although there are multiple OTT platforms in India, OTT simply stands for over the top. OTT platforms, there are multiple OTT platforms. The regulation is not done by the government, rather there is a self-regulation in India. Remember this, rather there is a self-regulation in India. And that is no law, there is no single piece of legislation which is used to regulate these entities. They will have to self-regulate. In that particular context, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has introduced in 2021 Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code, and this has been introduced under the Information Technology Act. According to these particular guidelines, the exhibitors, or let's say the OTT platforms, are supposed to follow certain process whenever they will display these programs over the platform. For example, now the Information and Broadcasting Ministry has argued that if the platforms do not regulate themselves, if they don't go for self-regulation and they do not control the exhibition of, let's say glorification of drugs in multiple programs that are, let's say, put on these particular platforms, which are seen by the children, which are seen by the youngsters, that might lead to more harm to the society rather than doing good, then more regulation shall be imposed by the government. Now, what is the kind of regulation is the government talking about? In fact, there's a term called as age-based category classification. There is a term mentioned here, age-based category of classification. That is, whenever the films or let's say the web series or even any other programs are run on these particular platforms, according to the guidelines of Government of India, there is a need to display certain message. For example, there is a age-based category classification that has been prescribed under this, wherein a certificate on the lines of CBFC certification itself has been proposed, and these OTT platforms are supposed to display that. You have a certificate by U bar A is there. There is a certificate, right, U bar A 7+. That is basically it is advisable that the people who are watching this or children who are watching this are above the age of 7 years. There is a classification of U bar A 13+, U bar A 16+ is there. right? A certification is there or even yes certification. So basically the government already under the guidelines has asked these OTT platforms to display this kind of a certification whenever you watch the programs, whenever you watch these programs on the OTT platform. And in many of the cases, it has been seen that they are not following this. There is no uniformity which has been followed. And that's the reason now the I&B ministry says, if the OTT platforms do not follow it, then there will be higher classification, more regulation shall be imposed by the government of India. Okay. Next, there is an article regarding, right, the gold consumption in Kerala. The Supreme Court simply says, carrying gold from Gulf, a typical problem, right, regarding state of Kerala. What are the important points here? Listen to me very carefully. There is an act of Government of India. The act is essentially COFEPOSA. Right? What is this? Conservation of Foreign Exchange and Prevention of Smuggling Activities Act of 1974. I'll repeat this. Conservation of Foreign Exchange and Prevention, not preservation, Prevention of Smuggling Activities Act of 1974. Under this particular act, if Government of Indian authorities such as, let's say, Enforcement Directorate or Department of Revenue Intelligence or even the Customs Department, is it okay? Under this act, Department of Revenue Intelligence, Customs Department or even Enforcement Directorate, if they believe that you can be involved in either smuggling activity or let's say any activity that will erode the foreign exchanges in India, they can go for preventive detention. They are allowed to go for preventive detention. Right? What is the meaning of preventive detention? It is enough that they believe that you can be involved in smuggling activity. Right? They don't have to be having any kind of proof now. It is just sufficient that they believe that you can be involved or you will be involved in the future in the smuggling activity. In such cases, they can go for preventive detention up to a period of 12 months. Up to 12 months, they can go for preventive detention. Unlike, let's say, any kind of criminal laws or criminal activities. In this case, if you are involved in smuggling, if you are storing the goods which are there or which are smuggled, if you are harboring anybody who is involved in smuggling, that is more than sufficient. That is more than sufficient for these authorities to put you under preventive detention. And the Supreme Court of India has made certain oral observations and has issued an order talking about the same piece of legislation in the context of one person in Kerala. This person in Kerala was picked up by the government authorities, put under preventive detention. Appeal against this was done in High Court and High Court ruled in the favor of the person. The wife of the arrested person or the person put under preventive detention went to High Court and got an order, got the person released. And against this, the government approached Supreme Court of India. And the Supreme Court simply says, it is a very common practice in Kerala to bring, right, let's say gold from, right, the other countries such as UAE. They feel or they basically believe that it is part of their investment. Right, so these are certain important points. Again, gold being brought into India is not important here. I hope you understand. How much gold is being brought by this particular person, how much money was spent by him, that is not at all relevant for UPSC. What is important, what is relevant is this act. Because this act is generally not mentioned, not discussed in the newspaper, and suddenly this has appeared in the, right, let's say newspaper because of the Supreme Court judgment regarding upholding of the High Court judgment which released the person being detained under the act. Done? Now let me ask a very simple question. How many of you know how much is the quantity of gold that you can bring from, right, let's say Dubai when you return back? When you return back, how much is the quantity of the gold? Right, please do let me know in the chat section or do let me know in the comment section if you're watching a recorded version. Okay, next. VGF and the port issue. The Kerala government has written a letter to the Prime Minister, and there is a statement which has been made regarding this in the, let's say, Parliament now. What is the issue? Issue is very simple. The Kerala government took assistance of the central government in the form of viability gap funding. What is viability gap funding? Whenever you develop infrastructure, if there is a concern regarding financial viability of the project, most of you are saying 20 grams. My dear, is it uniform for everyone? Do let me know. Is it uniform? Is it different for men and women, or is it uniform? So under the viability gap funding, under the VGF model, imagine you want to develop an infrastructure. This infrastructure will lead to, let's say, better transportation. This will lead to, let's say, generation of jobs. It will lead to demand for raw materials, etc. In such cases, economically, the project is feasible. Economically, the project is needed. But on the other side, what if you are not able to generate sufficient amount of revenue from the project? So, financial viability of the project, having invested so much amount of money, is a problem. In such cases, the government provides funding in the form of VGF. Please remember this, viability gap funding. So, the government of India has provided viability gap funding for 2 different projects. But in one of these particular projects, government says the money has to be returned by the state government. Against this directive of the central government, the Chief Minister of Kerala has written a letter to Prime Minister. Right? The argument which has been put forward by the Chief Minister is very simple. Whenever you talk about viability gap funding, it is given in the form of a grant. Grant means one-sided transfer. But when you talk about, let's say, repayment, in case of one of the ports, the central government, finance ministry has sought repayment of money. There is some calculation which has been done, and the finance minister says you will have to pay this much amount back. So the argument of the chief minister is, if you talk about repayment under viability gap funding, then this is not a grant. Because under VGF, you provide grant. But if you ask for repayment, this cannot be a grant. This will become a loan. And as of now, any project which has been covered under VGF, Government of India has not given a loan. That is the argument of the Chief Minister of Kerala. Done? Okay, so these are certain points regarding the article given here. Next article, increase the minimum PF pension. There is a parliamentary standing committee which is being headed by Mr. Basavaraj Bommai. This parliamentary standing committee has recommended to Government of India that the minimum amount of pension under EPS, right, that is Employee Pension Scheme 1995, the minimum amount of pension is 1,000 rupees. And there has been a demand from various labor organizations or the trade unions for multiple years now, where they have been demanding that this should be doubled, this should be increased to 2,000 rupees. In fact, earlier this proposal was put forward, but the Government of India has stuck it down. But now, the Parliamentary Standing Committee in the report has given the recommendation, and this report has been published, or this report has been introduced in the Parliament. Right? So, this was there in the discussion. Apart from this, why should you increase the minimum pension? What is the logic behind it? The logic is very simple. The 1,000 rupee minimum pension that has been decided in the last decade. But in the last 10 years, the prices of vegetables have increased. Inflation rate, in a nutshell, has increased. So what was the purchasing power of 1,000 rupees a decade ago is not the same as today. So when you realize that, you will know that, yes, a pension of 1,000 rupee which was given in 2014 will have a higher purchasing power compared to a pension of 1,000 rupee in 2024. And that's a precise reason why this standing committee has given a recommendation to the government, asking the government to increase the pension from 1,000 rupees to 2,000 rupees. Right? So that is one point. And apart from this, there is one more important point. Just make a note of this. Whenever you talk about EPS, the union government will also make certain contribution. 8.33% is supposed to be made by the first party, and the union government will contribute to 1.16% of wages. Remember this particular point as well. I'll repeat the statement. Whenever the EPS contribution, that is if you're covered under EPS, you'll have to contribute 7.8%, somewhere in the range of that, you'll have to contribute, and 1.16%, I'm saying 8.3% you'll have to contribute, and 1.16 will be contributed by the government. Right? So this is one more point which has been mentioned here. Okay? Done? Now, last two articles, not much of information is there, or you don't have to read all the articles regarding Mr. Zakir Hussain, a very well-known artist. It's a great loss, but let's look at certain important points. Mr. Zakir Hussain was conferred with the Padma Shri in 1988, Padma Bhushan in 2002, and Padma Vibhushan in 2023. In addition to this, Zakir Hussain also won 4 Grammys. Out of 4 Grammys, 3 were won this year itself. He was awarded the Sangeet Natak Academy Award. He has also been awarded with the highest award for a traditional artist in the United States of America, that is National Heritage Fellowship. We lost Mr. Zakir Hussain yesterday, and in that particular context, these particular points will become important. Just factual information, please make a note of this. In addition to this, in Hindustan Times, there was one more article. Right? As usual, there was one more article. We also lost one more environmentalist yesterday by the name of Tulasi Gouda. Comes from Karnataka. And why this becomes important? Tulasi Gouda belonged to a particular community by the name of Halakki tribe. Remember this can be asked in UPSC prelims. Belongs to Halakki tribe. She was a very well-known environmentalist. She has been given or conferred with Padma Shri in the year 2023. She was known for her environmental activities, where she planted thousands of trees. Right? After retirement, she was working for Forest Department. After retirement, she is known to be involved in planting of trees. Right? So, she belongs to Halakki tribe. This particular Halakki tribe inhabits the Western Ghats in multiple, the cities in the state of Karnataka. And this particular tribe is very well known. Please be very careful. This kind of a question can be asked in the preliminary examination. Done? Okay. So, let me take up the MCQs that I have given earlier. Consider the following statements regarding National Rail Plan 2030. It has aimed to increase the freight share to 45%. Yes. 100% electrification of the railways. Yes, that is also one of the very important provisions. And finally, it aims to reduce transit time of the trains. That is essentially under this plan. I have not discussed this particular point, and the students will basically say, sir, you did not discuss, but you gave a point. Purposely, I have given this. So, under this particular plan, the average speed of the train is supposed to be increased to 50 km. As a result of this, the transit time, that is the transportation time, will actually come down. Reduce the transit time of the trains. Yes, all the 3 statements are true. Right option will be option C, all of the 3. MCQ number 49. Consider the following statements. The peak rate allowed under GST law is 28%. Purposely I have given this, because the highest rate of GST right now is 28. But please understand, in addition to highest rate of 28%, there is also a compensation cess. But that is cess, additional tax. Okay. So, under the GST law, is it 28%? No. Allowed under GST is 40%. So, first statement wrong. GST is an example of ad valorem tax. Yes. Indirect taxes are progressive in nature Absolutely no. Indirect taxes are regressive in nature. These are not progressive in nature. Generally, indirect taxes are considered to be regressive in nature. Regressive essentially means as your income keeps on increasing, the percentage of income that you will pay to the government in the form of taxes will keep on reducing. As against this is progressive. Let's say income taxes. As your income keeps on increasing, more and more percentage you will keep on paying to the government. That is progressive. Okay, so indirect taxes are generally considered to be regressive in nature. Third is wrong. Right option is option A. Only one of the statement is true. Now, before I wind up, I had made an announcement yesterday. That is, if any of you have a doubt regarding economic concepts, please do leave a comment. I'll answer it to you. There was one student who raised a question, sir, what are the different types of banks in India? Right? I get confused. What are the different types of banks? My dear, please understand, whenever you talk about banks, there are multiple classifications. The broadest classification can be one, that is scheduled banks as well as non-scheduled banks. Scheduled as well as non-scheduled. Right? What do you mean by scheduled as well as non-scheduled? Scheduled are registered under Schedule 2 of RBI Act. Non-scheduled are not registered under that. Right? So there is one classification, scheduled as well as non-scheduled. There is also a classification that is basically the development financial institutions, DFIs, development financial institutions. This is one. There is a universal bank. This is another. And there is a niche bank or differentiated bank. Niche bank or differentiated bank. What is the basic idea? The development financial institutions, DFIs. Example, the earlier ICICI, not today, earlier ICICI. Right? Or for that matter, IDBI. Or the latest one, NABFID, National Bank for Financing Infrastructure Development. Or Exim Bank. Right? All these are called as development finance institutions. These essentially will provide lending for development of infrastructure, for promotion of infrastructure. Right? These are called as DFIs. Universal banks and differentiated banks. Whenever you talk about banking, there is a concept of primary functions and secondary functions. Primary functions are giving loans and collecting deposits. Secondary, insurance, locker facility, etc. That is secondary functions. If a bank will perform both primary and secondary, these are called as universal banks. Example, SBI. If a bank will perform very few of the functions, very limited functions, these are called as differentiated banks. Example, Paytm, earlier Paytm Payment Bank. Right? So, payment banks, small finance banks, these are essentially called as differentiated banks. Done? So, these are the different classification of the banks which are generally used and which are required for you for appearing for civil services examination. Again, I reiterate the same argument here. If you people have any kind of questions regarding economy, tomorrow again, I am only taking care of the CNA. Please do let me know in the comment section below. I will take up and discuss those particular questions. So that's it from my side in today's discussion. If you like these initiatives, do hit the like button. And do not forget, if you are yet to subscribe to our YouTube channel, kindly do it right now. Thank you. Have a great day.